On October 16, 2009, at 7 o'clock 40 minutes in the morning, the ranger on duty at the Johnston Ridge Observatory last spotted a group of 4 people. 45-year-old Professor Lawrence Meyer and 3 of his best students, Mark, Allison, and David, had headed deep into the restricted zone of Mount St. Helens, officially declaring the purpose of studying soil recovery. They looked like an ordinary scientific expedition planning to return to civilization in 2 days. However, when the search team found a broken digital camera 3 miles off the hiking trail 2 weeks later, investigators would not find footage of nature, but 14 seconds of pure horror. On the recording, 3 young people panic and run up the scree, fleeing from the man they trusted with their lives. The mountain would hide their bodies under a 15-foot layer of snow for exactly 8 months, until a June thaw revealed the truth about the cruel trap from which there was no escape. On October 16, 2009, at 7 o'clock 40 minutes in the morning, a new entry appeared in the tourist log at the ranger post near Johnston Ridge Observatory. It was made with a black ballpoint pen, and the handwriting was smooth and confident. In the column, Team Leader was a name, Lawrence Meyer. The number of participants was 4. The professor stated the purpose of the visit was to study the restoration of soil cover on the northern slope after the eruption of 1980. The scheduled return time was October 18, 17 hours 00 minutes. 3 students stood at the counter with the 45-year-old professor. 21-year-old Mark Sterling, captain of the university's track and field team, nervously adjusted the straps of his backpack. Next to him, 20-year-old Allison Craig stood looking at a map. A little further away, 22-year-old David Pack was waiting, leaning against the wall. The ranger on duty who issued the permit later recalled that the group looked well-equipped, but strangely silent. There were no jokes or conversations between them, typical of students going on a hike. Only short, sporadic commands from the professor. At 8 o'clock and 15 minutes, the group left the observatory and started hiking. The sky over the Cascade Mountains was overcast with heavy gray clouds. Forecasters predicted that the weather would worsen, but there was no storm warning yet. That was the last time Mark, Allison, and David were seen alive. The 18th of October passed without any news. When the clock crossed the 19 o'clock mark and Meyer's group did not appear at the control point and did not get in touch, the search and rescue protocol was activated. The situation was complicated by the fact that the phones of all the expedition members were silent. They had not been registered in the network since the morning of October 16th, which was abnormal even for mountainous terrain with poor coverage. On the morning of October 19, a large-scale search headquarters was set up in the Tuttle River Valley. 2 National Guard helicopters equipped with thermal imagers took to the air. 5 groups of professional rescuers and 3 dog teams worked on the ground. However, the weather, as is often the case in the mountains in the fall, played against the people. The thick fog hanging over the gorges gave way to freezing rain. The fine volcanic dust underfoot turned into slippery, viscous mud that made it impossible to move quickly and completely destroyed any traces. The dogs, trained to pick up the scent even after several days, were powerless. The smell was washed away by the rain, and the specific chemical composition of the volcanic soil confused the animals. The rescuers combed square by square along the official boundary trail, descended into ravines and inspected caves, but found only emptiness. No abandoned equipment, no trace of a campfire, no fragments of food packaging. The group of 4 adults seemed to have vanished into a gray fog. The search lasted for 2 weeks. With each passing day, the hope of finding the students alive was melting away. The temperature at night dropped below 0, and it was almost impossible to survive without shelter and heating in such conditions. On October 30th, the active phase of the operation began to wind down, transferring the case to the status of missing persons. The breakthrough occurred on November 2nd, when most of the volunteers had already left. One of the volunteers of the search team, combing a sector 3 miles away from the official route, noticed an unnatural shine at the bottom of a dry stream bed. A digital video camera lay between two basalt boulders, half covered in wet ash. Its body was cracked and the lens was broken, as if it had been violently thrown against the rocks. The camera was immediately taken to the State Police Crime Lab. Despite the damage to the body, the memory card inside remained intact. Experts were able to recover the data. Among the dozens of images of landscapes and geological rocks was one video file. It was the last one. It was dated October 15th, and the time was 15 hours and 20 minutes. The investigators who gathered around the monitor to watch it expected to see a farewell recording, perhaps the last message of the lost tourists. But what they saw made the experienced officers shudder. The video lasted exactly 14 seconds. The image was shaking a lot. The camera jumped chaotically, capturing either the leaden sky or muddy boots. Judging by the angle, the device was hanging around the neck or attached to the chest of the running cameraman. The backs of 3 people were in the frame. They were Mark, Allison, and David, but they were not marching. They were running. They were running as hard as they could up a steep, scree slope, sinking into the ash. They weren't wearing backpacks. They threw all their equipment to lighten their weight. The sound on the recording was terrible. The heavy, hoarse, intermittent breathing of the man behind the camera could be heard through the wind noise. It was not the breathing of a victim, but of a hunter who, despite his fatigue, continues to pursue. At the 5th second, Allison Craig, who was running last, stumbled. She turned back for a moment, directly into the lens. Her face was pale, distorted by a grimace of animal horror. Her eyes were wide open, and her mouth was open in a mute scream. She was not looking at the camera. She was looking into the eyes of the person holding her. She shouted something, but the words were drowned in the noise of the wind and the scraping of stones. The girl stood up abruptly and tried to speed up, catching up with the boys. The cameraman did not say a word. He continued to run after them, closing the distance. His shadow, long and ugly, fell for a moment on the girl's back. At the 12th second mark, the video jerked. The image turned upside down, gray clouds flashed, then dark outlines of rocks. There was a dull, unpleasant sound of plastic hitting stones. The camera fell. The last 2 seconds of the recording showed a still frame, a sloping horizon, and someone's feet in heavy hiking boots running past the lens in the direction of the fugitives. Then the screen went black. June of 2010 came late to the Cascade Mountains. The past winter had been one of the harshest in decades, with snow cover on the northern slope of the volcano reaching 15 feet in some places. Mount St. Helens, like a giant safe, was safely hiding its secrets under a layer of ice and compressed snow. It was only in early summer, when the stable above-zero temperatures melted the snow caps, that the volcano began to reluctantly give back what it had taken 8 months earlier. On June 14, 2010, a group of surveyors led by Roy Miller received permission to work in a closed sector known as the Red Zone. It was an area with unstable ground where access to tourists was strictly prohibited. The group's task was to conduct control measurements of soil erosion after the winter season. The work went according to plan until 11 o'clock and 30 minutes. As Miller moved along the crest of one of the side spurs, he noticed through his binoculars an unnatural detail at the bottom of a deep ravine 300 feet below. Among the monotonous gray of volcanic ash and black basalt, a bright orange spot stood out. The color was too saturated for a natural formation. It could be a piece of plastic, a forgotten tent, or a piece of equipment. The surveyors decided to descend to check it out. The descent was difficult. The slopes were crumbling underfoot, and there were still islands of dirty snow in the shadow of boulders. When the group got within 50 feet of the bottom of the ravine, Roy Miller gestured to his colleagues to stop. What looked like garbage from above took on a horrifying shape up close. At the bottom of a narrow stone crevasse, leaning against a steep rock wall, lay the remains of 3 people. Time, moisture, and local scavengers had done their work, but the clothes, made of modern synthetic materials, were surprisingly well preserved. It was the bright orange windbreaker of one of the victims that attracted the attention of the surveyors. The bodies were lying in a close group, intertwined with each other. It was a characteristic posture for people dying of hypothermia. In the last moments of life, they instinctively huddled together, trying to keep the remnants of heat. They were sitting in a kind of circle with their heads buried in their knees. The sight was so eerie in its silence that the surveyors did not immediately dare to come closer. Miller contacted the base by radio and reported the discovery. It took almost a day to evacuate the bodies. Investigators worked at the scene with the utmost care, recording every detail. The identification of the victims was easy. In the pockets of their jackets, they found student IDs in sealed plastic cases that protected the documents from moisture. They were Mark Sterling, Allison Craig, and David Park, the same students who disappeared last fall. However, the most important thing was who was not found among them. The 4th body, Professor Lawrence Meyer, was not in the ravine. The bodies were taken to the Cowlitz County morgue for autopsies. The report of the chief medical examiner, Dr. Sarah Jenkins, was ready 48 hours later. The official cause of death for all 3 was the same: deep hypothermia. They froze to death when their body temperature dropped to critical levels. However, a detailed examination of the bones revealed facts that changed the qualification of the case from an accident to a triple murder. On the body of 22-year-old David Pack, experts found a serious lifelong injury. His left ulna was crushed. The nature of the fracture indicated that the blow had been inflicted by a heavy, blunt object with great force. It was a typical self-defense injury. The guy reflexively raised his arm to shield his head from the blow. The finger bones of all 3 victims had numerous scraping wounds and missing nail plates. Under a microscope, particles of basalt were found in the wounds. They pulled the stones with their bare hands, trying to get out until the cold took away their last strength. In parallel with the work of the pathologists, a team of forensic scientists led by Detective Harrison conducted a detailed examination of the site where the bodies were found. The ravine that became the student's grave had a specific geological structure. It was a so-called blind canyon, a natural depression with 3 sheer walls over 20 feet high. The only way out of this trap was through a narrow mouth that gently rose to the main plateau. It was this exit that became the key to the solution. The passage was completely blocked by a pile of stones. At first glance, it looked like an ordinary collapse caused by erosion. But an experienced geologist involved in the investigation noticed the unnaturalness of the structure. The large boulders were lying too densely, forming an artificial barricade. Characteristic scratches and chips were found on the surface of some of the stones, which weighed more than 100 pounds. Metallographic examination confirmed the presence of microscopic particles of hardened steel in these scratches. The stones had not fallen by themselves. They had been moved using an ice pick or crowbar as a lever. The picture of the crime began to take shape. The students did not get lost and fall into the pit by accident. They were driven into this dead end. And then someone from the outside methodically and cold-bloodedly blocked the only way out by throwing stones. This unknown person turned a natural formation into a prison from which it was impossible to escape without special equipment. The students had neither ropes nor ice axes. Their backpacks, as the investigation remembered, were missing from the video. The absence of Lawrence Meyer's body among the dead now looked not like a miraculous rescue, but like an ominous sign. The professor was the only one who had the knowledge, experience, and physical strength to organize such a trap. The police immediately changed Meyer's status from missing to suspect number 1. An APB with his photo was sent to all police departments in Washington and Oregon. Investigators assumed that he could have left the country long ago, taking advantage of the 8-month head start that winter gave him. But while detectives were building theories about the professor's escape, one of the rangers who continued to inspect the perimeter around the crime scene noticed something strange in the snow 200 yards from the collapsed canyon entrance. The snow was melting unevenly, forming a mound that resembled the outline of a large object. The ranger came closer and began to shovel the muddy snow with his boot. Under the layer of ice, a fabric appeared. It was neither a stone nor a log. It was an old expedition backpack with straps that went deep into the snow, as if tied to something heavy that lay even deeper. Friends, before we continue to unravel this tangle of lies and tragedy, I have a small favor to ask of you. Please subscribe to the channel, click on the bell, and leave any comment below this video. It will only take you a few seconds, but it is critical for YouTube's algorithms. Your engagement helps me promote my videos so that as many people as possible can learn about these mysterious stories. Thank you for your support. And now let's get back to the events of 2009. To understand how a scientific expedition turned into a deadly trap, the investigation had to rewind time. Back to the time when Mark, Allison, and David were still alive, and their mentor, Professor Lawrence Meyer, was considered a model of academic integrity. In October of 2009, 45-year-old Lawrence Meyer was not just a teacher, he was a real star of the geology department. He was the author of 3 authoritative monographs, a participant in international conferences, and a man whose opinion carried weight in the scientific circles of Washington State. Students looked at him with admiration, colleagues with respect, and sometimes with hidden envy. His office, lined with awards and rare rock specimens, looked like a temple of science. No one at the university had any idea that behind this glossy facade was a man standing on the edge of an abyss. The truth came out only when detectives from the Financial Investigation Department obtained a court order to access the professor's bank accounts. What they saw was shocking. The genius of the faculty was bankrupt. His financial downfall began 3 years before the tragedy. Meyer suffered from a hidden but destructive gambling addiction. He spent weekends in underground poker clubs in Portland, losing thousands of dollars a night. In an attempt to recoup, he invested the rest of his savings in a risky real estate scheme that collapsed during the recession of 2008. By the fall of 2009, his debts had reached a catastrophic amount of $250,000. The bank had already sent a notice of foreclosure on his house. His credit cards were blocked, and debt collectors began calling even his department's office phone. Meyer was backed into a corner. He needed money, a lot of it, and fast, or his reputation and career would be ruined forever. The key event that triggered the mechanism of the future crime took place on October 9, 2009, exactly 7 days before the fatal attack. This meeting was reconstructed thanks to the testimony of a waitress at the Old Mill Diner, a roadside establishment located on a highway 50 miles from the national park. The woman, named Sarah Jenkins, recognized the photography professor on the evening news after the group disappeared. She told investigators that Meyer was sitting in the farthest corner of the room that rainy evening. He looked nervous, kept looking back at the entrance and wiping sweat from his forehead with paper napkins, even though the room was cool. His interlocutor was a man in his 40s, dressed in a leather jacket, with a distinctive scorpion tattoo on his neck. The investigation was never able to identify this man, but the content of their conversation, which was partially overheard by the waitress, left no doubt about the professor's intentions. According to Sarah's testimony, Meyer spoke quietly, almost in a whisper, but his voice was desperate. "I will get the glass," he said, nervously tapping his fingers on the table. "I know the exact coordinates. The vein opened up after the last landslide. It's the purest specimen you've ever seen. I just need time and people to bring it out." The detectives consulted with mineralogy experts and figured out what the deal was all about. Meyer planned to steal a rare type of volcanic obsidian known on the black market as black tear. This unique mineral was formed in only one area of the crater after the eruption of 1980. Its extraction was strictly prohibited by federal law, as this zone was considered unstable and life-threatening. However, among private collectors, the price for 1 pound of such a rough stone could reach $3,000. The professor knew about the deposit, which others did not, and saw it as the only way out of the debt hole. But there was one major problem with his plan. Obsidian is a heavy stone. To earn enough money to pay off his debts, he needed to remove at least 200 pounds of the rock from the crater. A 50-year-old man with a bad back could not have done this task alone, especially on rough terrain. He needed helpers. Mules is the smuggler's jargon for carriers of illegal cargo. Meyer was afraid to hire professional criminals. They could rob him, blackmail him, or turn him in to the police. He needed people who were physically tough, obedient, and who would not arouse the suspicions of the rangers at the checkpoints. The ideal candidates were right in front of him, in the university classrooms. Meyer spent the next few days carefully selecting his victims. He analyzed the students' personal files, looking for a combination of physical strength and dedication to science. His choices were cold and pragmatic. Mark Sterling is the captain of the track and field team, hardy, able to walk tens of miles with a load. David Park is a farm boy, strongly built, used to hard physical labor. Allison Craig was a frail but fanatically devoted geology student who idolized her advisor and would not ask too many questions about the route. Meyer acted like an experienced manipulator. He called each of them to his office separately. The conversation took place behind closed doors. The investigation was unable to find recordings of these conversations, but the testimony of the dorm mates helped to recreate the essence of the proposal. The professor did not talk about stones or money. He was talking about science. He offered the students to participate in a secret expedition, the results of which, he said, would be a sensation and guarantee them a place in the best graduate schools in the country. He called it an exclusive practice, available only to a select few. "This is your ticket to the future," he told them, looking them straight in the eye. For the young people who dreamed of a scientific career, refusal was impossible. They saw it as the chance of a lifetime, a recognition of their talents. They did not know that for Meyer, they were just free labor, a consumable needed to transport stolen goods. On October 14th, 2 days before they were to leave, Meyer gave them their final briefing. He ordered the students to take the largest expeditionary backpacks they had and a minimum of personal belongings. "We'll need space for the samples," he explained. The students nodded happily, unaware that they were signing consent to participate in a federal crime. The trap was set, and the victims voluntarily stepped into it. The morning of October 16th, 2009 in the Cascade Mountains was gloomy and unfriendly cold. The thick fog that had descended from the peaks during the night enveloped the valley in a dense blanket, reducing visibility to a critical minimum. It was in these conditions that the last day of the last sightings of Professor Meyer's group began. At 5:30 in the morning, video surveillance cameras in the lobby of the Pine View Lodge roadside motel captured 4 figures walking down to the dining room. It was the only establishment within a 20-mile radius that served early breakfast, so the room was nearly empty. The only witness to the events of that morning was the night manager, Robert Hayes, whose testimony later formed the basis of the reconstruction of the professor's behavior. According to Hayes, the atmosphere at the table by the window was far from friendly. Lawrence Meyer, dressed in an expensive storm jacket, looked overly focused, almost aggressive. He didn't touch his food, only nervously twirled a cup of black coffee in his hands, constantly glancing at his wristwatch. The students, Mark, Allison, and David, ate in silence, not daring to look up at their mentor. It was clear that the usual university hierarchy had been transformed into something more rigid, reminiscent of an army chain of command. The key episode that finally cut the group off from the outside world occurred at 5:50. Hayes, who was wiping down the bar, became an unwitting witness to a strange scene. Professor Meyer took a thick, sealed bag with a plastic lock from his inside pocket and placed it in the center of the table. His voice, though muffled, was clear and categorical. "There is abnormal magnetic activity in the square where we will be working," he said in a tone that did not allow for objections. "Your phones will fail in minutes if they are not shielded. Besides, any signal could throw off the calibration of my equipment. Hand over all your gadgets. You'll get them back when we get back to the car." It was an outright lie. There was no magnetic anomaly in the area of Mount St. Helens, and cell phones could not affect the geological instruments, which, by the way, the professor did not even have with him. However, Meyer's credibility was so unquestionable that none of the students suspected fraud. Mark Sterling was the first to put his phone in the bag. He was followed by Allison and David. This moment was the point of no return. By voluntarily giving away their means of communication, the young people deprived themselves of their only chance of escape in the event of an emergency. Meyer sealed the package and hid it in his bag. From now on, their lives depended entirely on his decisions. At 6:15, the group left the motel. Their path was to the northern slope of the volcano. The car ride was in complete silence. Allison Craig, according to her friend, to whom she had sent a short message in the evening, felt anxious, but attributed it to the excitement of an important scientific work. Upon arrival and registration, the group took the Boundary Trail. It was an official, marked hiking trail, safe and tested by thousands of visitors. They walked the first 2 miles at a good pace. The fog cleared a bit, revealing views of the gloomy landscapes of the exclusion zone, where nature was still slowly recovering from the disaster of 1980. The problems began at the 3rd mile of the journey. According to the plan that Meyer had outlined to the rangers, they were supposed to move further east to the safe plateaus. Suddenly, however, the professor stopped and pointed to the left, toward a dense thicket of wild alder and a pile of sharp basalt stones. There was no trail there. The so-called red zone began there, an area with unstable soil that is strictly off-limits to visitors. We turn off here, Meyer said, adjusting his heavy backpack. Our point is over that ridge. Mark Sterling, who had experience in mountain hiking and was well-versed in the terrain, stopped like a shot. He knew exactly what this turn meant. Ahead lay a slope with a high risk of landslides, especially after the recent rains. The soil there consisted of loose ash and pumice stone, ready to slide down at the slightest vibration. "Professor, this is a mistake," Mark said firmly, blocking Allison's path. "There is no stable ground there, and we have no right to go there without special equipment and insurance. Look at the slope. It's breathing." It was the first moment of open disobedience. David and Allison froze, looking from Mark to the professor. For a moment it seemed that common sense would prevail, but Lawrence Meyer was not going to back down. He came up close to Mark, violating his personal space, and looked at him with cold disdain. "Do you think I got my degree sitting on a couch, Sterling?" Meyer's voice was quiet but menacing. "I know this volcano better than you know your own room. We go where there are unique specimens, not where it's convenient for tourists to walk. If you're afraid of getting your boots dirty, you can come back. But forget about graduate school and my recommendation. The choice is yours." It was blackmail, direct and brutal. Meyer was hitting the most painful part of the young man's ambitions. Mark hesitated for a few more seconds. He looked at the foggy slope, then at his friends who were waiting for his decision. He understood the danger, but the authority of his mentor and the fear of losing his career outweighed his instinct for self-preservation. "We're coming for you," Mark said quietly, stepping aside. Meyer nodded in satisfaction and was the first to step into the tall grass that hid the dangerous chasms. The group followed him, stepping off the hard path into the unknown. They crossed an invisible line that separated the safe world from the deadly trap that not only nature, but also the man they trusted, had prepared for them. The fog closed in behind them, cutting off the way back. By 12 o'clock 40 minutes on October 16, 2009, the group had reached their destination. It was a remote plateau, hidden behind the crest of a high basalt ridge, a place that was not on any tourist map. Absolute silence reigned here, broken only by the whistling of the wind in the gorges. The pumice stone crunched underfoot, and as far as the eye could see, the black desert stretched out, dotted with sharp fragments of rock. Lawrence Meyer stopped at the foot of a low rock wall and threw off his pack. He looked tired, but there was an unhealthy excitement in his eyes. The professor pointed to a scattering of black stones that sparkled with a wet sheen even under the gloomy sky. These were blocks of obsidian, a volcanic glass formed as a result of the instantaneous cooling of lava. "This is our goal," he said, and for the first time that day, his voice sounded like a note of triumph. "We must fill the backpacks to the maximum. Every pound counts for the lab." The students, exhausted from the difficult walk across the loose soil, silently began to follow the order. They walked to the placer, picked up the heavy, cold stones, and put them into their expedition backpacks. The work was exhausting. The sharp edges of the obsidian cut their fingers even through protective gloves, and the weight of the backpacks was growing rapidly. Meyer did not help. He stood aside, watching the process like a supervisor at a quarry, and only occasionally spurred them on with sharp shouts. It was at this moment that a factor came into play that the professor, in his arrogance, had not taken into account. Allison Craig was not just a diligent student. Mineralogy was her passion. She knew everything about volcanic rocks that could be learned from textbooks and museum collections. When the girl picked up another fragment and brought it to her eyes to assess the structure, her movements froze. It was not just an obsidian, it was a black tear, an extremely rare variety with an iridescent shimmer that was valued by jewelers above some precious stones. But it was not just about beauty. Allison knew the sampling protocols perfectly. A few samples weighing no more than 500 grams are enough for a complete chemical and spectral analysis in the laboratory. Meyer made them weigh tens of pounds. She looked back at the professor, who had just stepped aside a few yards, ostensibly to survey the area, but in fact, as the investigation later suggested, to check the escape route. Allison seized the moment and approached the boys. Her face was pale. "This is not science," she whispered, clutching Mark's jacket sleeve. According to the reconstruction based on the psychological profiles of the victims, she was the first to voice the terrible truth. "These are not tests for the department. These are raw materials. Jewelry raw materials. He forces us to steal stones that are worth a lot of money on the black market. We are carrying tens of thousands of dollars on our backs." Mark and David looked at each other. The puzzle was beginning to come together. The strange route, the confiscated phones, the secrecy, the professor's nervousness, none of it had anything to do with science. David tried to argue, looking for a logical explanation, but Mark Sterling, who had long felt uneasy, decided to act. Meyer was far enough away, standing with his back to them and staring into the misty distance of the canyon. His personal backpack lay on a large, flat boulder 10 steps away from the students. Mark, ordering his friends to continue pretending to work, quickly and silently approached his mentor's belongings. He hoped to find a satellite phone to call for help, or at least scientific equipment, dosimeters, gas analyzers, something that would justify the professor's strange behavior. But when he unzipped the top flap, his heart skipped a beat. On top, wrapped in an oily rag, was a pistol. It was not a combat weapon, but a large-caliber traumatic pistol, capable, however, of causing serious injury or even death when fired at close range. Next to the weapon was a rolled-up map. It was not a topographical map of the park, which is given to tourists. It was a detailed map of smuggling trails, with markers not indicating elevations or water sources, but hiding places. Each marker was labeled not with geological terms, but with dollar amounts and pound weights. Mark recoiled from the backpack as if it were a poisonous snake. A ringing sounded in his head. Reality had turned upside down. They were not the chosen students, the future of American science. They were mules, a disenfranchised hauling force used to commit a federal crime. He turned to his friends. Allison and David read the verdict in his eyes. "There are guns," Mark said with one lip, "and a map of the caches. He's not a scientist. He's a criminal." The atmosphere on the plateau changed instantly. The cold wind now seemed like the icy breath of death. The students realized they were trapped. The man who had brought them here was armed and cornered by debt. He could not let them just leave and tell what they had seen. Witnesses in such cases are a direct road to prison. If they refuse to carry the load or try to escape, Meyer will stop at nothing. They have become dangerous ballast for him. Mark hadn't yet closed the professor's backpack when he heard the crunch of gravel behind him. Lawrence Meyer was coming back. He walked slowly, keeping his hands in his jacket pockets. He no longer wore the mask of a concerned scientist. He saw where Mark was standing. He saw that his backpack was unzipped, and he was smiling that terrible, empty smile of a man with nothing left to lose. "I think we're done with the lecture part," he said quietly, his voice sounding louder than thunder. And now we're going to work. And I don't advise you to do anything stupid." He took another step, and his right hand slowly reached for his belt, where another argument for obedience might be hidden under his jacket. Mark, Allison, and David froze, realizing that the next second would decide whether they would return from this mountain alive. The culmination of the confrontation on the plateau came at 13 hours and 15 minutes on October 16, 2009. It is this time that experts consider to be the point of no return, the moment when psychological pressure turned into a physical struggle for survival. A cold wind blowing from the north at 30 miles per hour muffled the words, but the sign language was clear even without sound. Lawrence Meyer stood 10 paces away from the group. He immediately noticed the change. The backpacks that the students had been filling with smuggled obsidian a minute ago were lying on the ground at Mark and David's feet. They were empty. It was an act of open rebellion. But what was even more dangerous for the professor was what he saw in Mark Sterling's hands, his own map with the hiding places. At that moment, the mask of a benevolent mentor finally came off. Meyer realized that his plan had been exposed. There was no turning back. If these three went down and reached the ranger post, his life would end in federal prison. Fear of debt and prison transformed into the aggression of a cornered animal. He didn't take the gun out of his backpack. It would have taken precious seconds, and firing in the mountains could have attracted unnecessary attention from other groups, if there were any within a few miles. Instead, his hand pulled a heavy geological hammer with an all-metal handle and a pointed beak from a loop on his belt. It was a tool capable of splitting basalt, but in the hands of an enraged man, it turned into a deadly melee weapon. "Pick up the load!" was probably what Meyer shouted as he advanced on the students. His face was reddened with anger. The veins in his neck were swollen. He was closing the distance confidently, using his mass and experience in moving on the scree. The students, who saw their teacher in such a state for the first time, were numb. It was a classic shock effect. Their brains refused to believe that the man who had lectured them about tectonic plates yesterday was ready to break their heads today. With less than 5 feet between them, Meyer swung the hammer, intending to intimidate and possibly strike Mark, who was standing closest. And that's where David Pack's reaction kicked in. The guy who grew up on a farm and was used to physical labor acted instinctively. He did not back down. He lunged forward and pushed the professor with both hands into his chest with all his might. Meyer, not expecting resistance, lost his balance on the loose gravel. He flailed his arms and fell heavily on his back, dropping the hammer, which flew several feet away. It was a chance. The only chance. "Run!" Mark shouted. The three took off running. They couldn't run back toward the trail because Meyer was falling and blocking the path to the gentle slope. Instinct drove them in the opposite direction, up a steep slope covered with a deep layer of volcanic ash. It was the worst possible decision, but panic left no room for tactics. Meyer got up surprisingly quickly for a man of his age. The fall only fueled his rage. He grabbed the hammer, but instead of just rushing after it, he did something strange and yet logical to his twisted mind. His left hand pressed the record button on the digital camera hanging from his chest. The red light began to flash. Investigators assumed that in a state of affect, Meyer decided to record the attack of the students. Perhaps he planned to use the video as evidence that they had attacked him first, left him wounded in the mountains, or wanted to have blackmail material if he managed to get them back. Or he simply forgot to turn off the camera, which he had activated while demonstrating the samples. Either way, the recording of those fateful 14 seconds began. The chase was not a sprint. It was a grueling scramble up a surface that resembled quicksand. The students were mired in ash to the bone. Every step required a titanic effort. Allison, who had been running last, began to fall behind. Her breathing was ragged, her feet slipping. Meyer pursued them in silence. On the video that would later be found, only his heavy, raspy breathing was heard. He did not shout threats. He just followed them like an inescapable force. He knew this slope. He knew that there was no escape beyond the crest where the students were climbing. There began a system of narrow, winding ravines, which the locals called the labyrinth. The students, thinking that they were running away from danger, were actually running straight into the jaws of a trap. Meyer, having the advantage of knowing the terrain, deliberately shifted slightly to the right, cutting off their path to a traverse that could lead them to a nearby ridge and further to the tourist area. He drove them, like a shepherd driving a flock, deeper into the canyon, where the rocks closed together to form a dead end. When Allison looked back and screamed, the very moment captured on video, she saw more than just a teacher. She saw a man who was cutting off their paths to life in cold blood. Meyer was too close. The camera fell out of the professor's hands as he tripped over a rock outcropping, trying to grab the girl by the hood of his jacket. Hitting the ground stopped the recording, but not the chase. Meyer, leaving the camera lying in the riverbed, continued the pressure. The students went over the ridge and saw a narrow ravine with high walls in front of them. They thought it was a good place to hide or take up the defense. They did not know that this ravine did not have a through passage. They ran inside, hoping to get away from the pursuer, who had already appeared on the ridge behind them, silhouetted against the leaden sky. Lawrence Meyer stopped at the top. He was no longer in a hurry. He had seen where they had gone and knew there was no way out. Now he just had to take the last step to lock the cage. At 13 hours 45 minutes on October 16, 2009, the chaotic chase along the slopes of Mount St. Helens reached its fatal end. Lawrence Meyer, who had studied the geomorphology of the region for years, acted not as a trapped victim but as a cold strategist. He knew where he was taking his students. Mark, Allison, and David, blinded by panic and adrenaline, ran into a narrow gorge that cut into the mountain's body like a deep scar. From below, this passage seemed to be a safe haven. High basalt walls protected them from the wind, and as they thought, from the mad professor. But geographically, this place was a natural dead end, known among the old rangers as the Stone Bag. It was an erosive depression about 30 feet deep that had only one entrance, a narrow mouth no more than 6 feet wide, through which the fugitives had just run. When the students reached the far wall and realized that there was no way to go any further, they had only a sheer cliff in front of them. They turned around, but it was too late. Lawrence Meyer did not follow them down into the canyon. He stayed upstairs, on a rocky ledge that overhung the entrance. Investigators who later reconstructed the events of that day concluded that Meyer's actions were motivated not only by cruelty, but also by deep cowardice. He didn't have the courage to go down and engage in an open fight with two physically strong guys, even if he had the advantage of a geological hammer. He didn't want to get his hands dirty with blood in the truest sense of the word. He chose another way, to use the mountain itself as a murder weapon. Overlooking the entrance to the Stone Bag was a massive scree, a pile of unstable boulders and rock fragments that held together by word of mouth and friction. Meyer, as an experienced geologist, instantly assessed the situation. He took out his ice axe, which he always carried on the outside of his backpack, and used it as a lever. It took him only a few minutes and a little physical strength to break the fragile balance. He found the keystone that held the entire structure together and forced it up. At 13 o'clock and 55 minutes, the silence of the mountains was broken by a roar. Dozens of tons of stones mixed with earth and snow rushed down. It was not a natural landslide. It was a controlled local avalanche. The rocks filled the narrow mouth of the canyon with a roar, forming a dense plug over 10 feet high. A cloud of dust rose into the air, covering the students, who clung in terror to the far wall of the trap. When the dust settled, Mark, Allison, and David saw a new reality. The exit they had run through moments before had disappeared. Now they were surrounded by smooth, mossy walls 25 feet high and a fresh blockage that could not be dismantled from the inside without heavy machinery. They found themselves at the bottom of a stone well no more than 50 square feet. A voice came from above. Lawrence Meyer stood on the edge of the precipice, looking down at his captives. He did not look remorseful. On the contrary, his words, which the wind carried to the students in fragments, sounded like the arrogance of a man who believes he is in control. "Sit there and think," he shouted over the sound of the wind. "When you get hungry and realize who's in charge, I'll come back. We'll make a deal. You'll carry the load, and then I'll let you out." It was a lie, which he may have been trying to soothe his own conscience. He was not going to let them out. He was just postponing the problem, leaving the dirty work to nature. Meyer was convinced that a night in the cold ravine would make them docile. He turned around and disappeared over the ridge, leaving the students without food, without warm clothes. Their jackets were lightweight, designed for active movement, without backpacks, and without hope. But the professor, blinded by his own pride, made a fatal mistake. He ignored what all the meteorological reports had warned about that morning. The barometric pressure was falling at a catastrophic rate. At about 16 hours 00 minutes, the sky above the St. Helens volcano, which had been gray before, turned black. The air temperature, which had been at 40 degrees Fahrenheit, began to drop rapidly. Within an hour, it dropped to 25 degrees. The wind changed to a gale-force north wind, bringing with it ice needles. A blizzard began. It was not just snowfall, but a real Arctic storm that hits the Cascade Mountains every few years. Inside the stone bag, the conditions became unbearable. The stone walls, which used to protect against the wind, have now turned into cold storage. The students, locked in a cramped space, had no way to warm themselves by moving. They huddled together, but the cold penetrated to their very bones. Mark tried to organize an escape attempt. They tried to build a living pyramid by standing on each other's shoulders to reach the edge of the wall. But the slippery basalt, covered with a crust of ice, gave them no chance to catch hold. David scraped his fingers until they bled, trying to find a foothold, but each time he fell down. Allison was crying, her strength melting faster than the boys. Meanwhile, Lawrence Meyer, who was already walking down to his car, also felt the breath of the storm. The snow was covering his eyes. The wind was knocking him down. He thought he was punishing the students, but in fact, he was signing a death warrant for more than just them. Nature, which he tried to use as an accomplice, did not recognize masters. The curtain of snow was thickening every minute, hiding under a white shroud both the trap with the students and the lonely figure of the professor, who was slowly hobbling through the storm with a heavy backpack behind him. Night was falling on the mountain, and this night promised to be eternal. On June 17, 2010, 72 hours after the bodies of Mark, Allison, and David were brought to the surface, the search operation in the St. Helens area entered its final phase. State police, with evidence of a triple murder in hand, expanded the search radius to find the main suspect. Lawrence Meyer was being sought as a fugitive, checking airports and borders, but detectives on the ground insisted on checking surrounding sectors. The clue was hiding much closer than anyone could have guessed. A group of rangers surveying the rugged terrain at the base of the Harry Ridge Range, located just 2 miles east of where the students died, spotted a strange object in a deep rock crevasse. 20 feet down, among the sharp basalt, was the body of a man. It was Lawrence Meyer. He did not run away to Mexico and spend the money from the sale of unique minerals. He remained on the mountain for all of those 8 months, sharing the cold fate of his victims. The examination of the scene and subsequent forensic examination allowed us to recreate the last hours of the professor's life with chilling accuracy. Meyer's death occurred on the night of October 16 to 17, 2009, the same night that his students were freezing in a stone trap. The cause of his death was an act of supreme, almost mystical irony. The professor was still wearing a huge expedition backpack on his back. When forensic experts cut open the stiffened fabric, what he had destroyed 4 lives for fell out. 70 pounds of black tear, a rare volcanic obsidian. Experts have determined that Meyer, leaving the students trapped, tried to get down to his car by the shortest route through the Harry Ridge. But he did not take into account the deteriorating weather. When the storm hit, visibility dropped to 0. On a slippery slope, under the weight of his backpack, he lost his balance. The fall was fatal. Meyer suffered an open fracture of the tibia of his right leg. He could not walk. But the worst part was that even in this situation, he did not take off his backpack. Tracks in the snow, preserved under a layer of ice, showed that he was trying to crawl, dragging 70 pounds of stones. His greed had literally pinned him to the ground. If he had dropped the straps and gotten rid of the load, he would have had a chance to get to the area where he had cell service or find shelter. But he chose the rocks. He froze to death in a few hours, clutching the straps of his backpack with blue fingers. A flare gun was found in his pocket, but he never used it, probably fearing that the rescuers would see his prey. Ironically, the digital camera he accidentally dropped while chasing the students became his main accuser, even before the body was found. 14 seconds of video told the investigation how it happened, and 70 pounds of glass in the dead professor's backpack explained why. The Meyer Group case was officially closed on June 20, 2010. The stones, which were worth tens of thousands of dollars on the black market, are now stored in the evidence room as unwanted cargo. In the history of the city and the university, Lawrence Meyer is remembered not as an outstanding geologist or author of monographs, but as a man who weighed the lives of 3 talented children and a pile of volcanic glass in the scales of conscience, and made his choice in favor of the latter. Mount St. Helens took all 4 of them, but only 3 of them left this world as victims, leaving the 4th forever in the grip of his own greed and eternal cold.